bring in our panel now. Mick Mulvaney is a NewsNation political contributor and a former White House chief of staff to President Trump. Aaron David Miller is a former Middle East negotiator with the State Department, and retired Lieutenant General Karen Gibson is the former Director of Intelligence for U.S. Central Command. It is great to have all three of you here. Mick, the President and the White House Rapid Response Unit are working overtime to sell this deal as a win. But they are running into severe headwinds. The conservative Wall Street Journal editorial board writes today that the United States, in essence, paid a ransom to open the strait and that Trump gave in to economic pressure. Quote, Trump was driven by fear of high oil prices and a falling stock market going into the midterm elections. The memo of understanding was reached from a position of U.S. weakness, not strength. From the deal's substantial upfront sanctions relief and the paucity of corresponding Iranian nuclear commitments, it shows. So a lot of people are not buying what Trump is selling.
Yeah, Elizabeth, you used the exact right term, which is the White House is trying to sell this. It's what Donald Trump is really good at. He's done it his whole life. This is really hard to sell. I'm still of the opinion that history will be the judge of this. It's way too early to sort of make a decision as to whether or not this was a good deal or a bad deal. But faced with what we're looking at right now, it's a really difficult thing for the White House to sell. Who's with the president on this? The Republicans don't seem to think it's a very good deal. The Democrats, of course, wouldn't think it's a very good deal. There's all sorts of things you could articulate as to why it's not a very good deal. But all the stuff that's supposed to be beneficial to the U.S. is going to come later, especially dealing with the Iran nuclear materials. This is a very difficult sell for them right now in the White House, and I don't think it gets any easier for the next 60 days.
Aaron, Trump is telling Axios that he won unconditional surrender from Iran. How does he say this is Iran surrendering when so many in his own party are saying it is Trump who surrendered to economic pressure?
Yeah, look, worked and voted for Republicans and Democrats. Jimmy Carter to Bush 43, saw Bush 41 wage a very successful war, first Iraq War, was part of Bush 43. Another story entirely. Look, let's be very clear here. Whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, I don't care. You're looking at reality here, and here's what you see. A flawed war of choice has not produced a flawed but potentially significant memorandum of understanding. The Iranians have weaponized geography. I don't know if the cliche is the horse has left the barn, the ship has sailed, whatever cliche you want to use. February 27th, when the straits were unfettered, recognized as an international waterway, innocent passage right notwithstanding, that day is over. The Iranians have demonstrated they can weaponize geography. You saw them yesterday in response to what happened in Lebanon, quote unquote, close the straits. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's a real challenge, and as Mick said, the test will come whether or not the Iranians are prepared to trade restrictions, dilution of their highly enriched uranium, and a suspension, a moratorium on enrichment for a lot of money. And it's an intriguing deal, but it'll take a lot of negotiations to produce it.
General, President Trump said this afternoon that the ships are flowing through the strait. We lifted our blockade on Iran, so Iranian ships, I guess, are moving freely. But preliminary data shows only 5 tankers went through today, and that's according to Kepler. Iran is telling ships they can't go through without permission from Iran, and even opened fire on a tanker today.
So I would say a couple of things there. One, I think you have to acknowledge the physics of it, even if it were truly unfettered, it will take time to get all of those ships through. They will not initially flow at the same rate. But one of the highlights that we've identified, or one of the challenges we've highlighted for the MOU, is how it's interpreted and whether or not ships are allowed to go through and under what conditions and what role Iran and possibly even Oman will play. That has yet to be determined, and I don't think we have a common understanding of that. And then the third one I would say is any kind of drag that makes the MOU look potentially infeasible is going to degrade commercial confidence that's required, not necessarily for the ships to get out of the Gulf, but to get back in. We've got to have confidence that this MOU is going to deliver security and stability, because it's really commercial confidence that drives those business decisions to operate.
Yeah, well, for that, you need trust. And Mick, Senator Kennedy of Louisiana uncorked another of his classics today, saying, "I trust Iran like I trust gas station sushi." Iran called off the talks after Israel bombed Lebanon. Vice President Vance is not checking into the spa resort in Switzerland where the talks are supposed to happen. He's here in Washington, and the 60-day clock is ticking.
There's a bunch of things that can go wrong, Elizabeth. Something can happen with Hezbollah. Something can happen with Israel. Something can happen with Iran or the United States, or even maybe another party we haven't thought about. I encourage people not to pay attention to the 60 days. Donald Trump has shown from the very beginning that when he says, well, we're going to give them, at the very beginning of the war, he was going to give it a couple of weeks of negotiations, and we started bombing. Then the war was going to be over in 2 to 3 weeks, and it went on for 4 or 5 months. The 60 days could be 160, it could be 16. And I think everybody's sitting back and say, well, this is going to be at least stable for the next 60 days. I think that's dramatically underestimating the tension. Robert Sherman used the exact right word in his reporting, the tension, and Trump, which is just he's not married to that 60 days. It's on the piece of paper, but it could change tomorrow.
Well, and when we talk about what could go wrong, something already did go wrong just hours into it, Aaron. Israel attacked Lebanon after Hezbollah attacked and killed 44 IDF soldiers. It was Hezbollah's drone strikes that started this all, but, Israel went in strong. And this came after yesterday's stern lecture from the vice president that Israel better knock off criticizing this deal and recognize that the U.S. is really its only ally on the world stage. The prime minister of Israel is in a real bind here.
He is, given the fact that Donald Trump owns the Republican Party. And Benjamin Netanyahu cannot, as he did in 2015, accept an invitation from John Boehner to address a joint meeting of Congress and rail against the Obama's nuclear agreement. Plus, in October, mid-September, October, he is going to face the most consequential election of his life. On trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in the Jerusalem District Court, 3 judges, 5 years and running. He could be convicted, or alternatively, if he loses power, he'll cut a plea deal, which will mean the end of his political career. That means one thing. Donald Trump needs to set up in Washington a campaign central headquarters, basically as he did in Trump 1.0, and in the 3 elections in 4 years that the Israelis had between 2018 and 2021, basically to campaign for Benjamin Netanyahu. Therefore, Netanyahu cannot afford a break. The question is whether Lebanon will produce some moment of truth in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. You know what the Taliban said? You have the clock, we have the time. I think the Iranians look at Trump's need for a deal, look at Lebanon, and they're thinking to themselves, I can insulate Hezbollah. We can push Trump to push Netanyahu to restrain Israel. And that may be a miscalculation. It should work this way. Iran should restrain Hezbollah. No strikes for 60, 90 days. Trump should restrain any Israeli military action to give these negotiations the time and space they need to test the proposition to whether or not they can actually succeed.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know. Based on what we're seeing, it in some ways looks like Iran is trying to put a schism between Trump and Netanyahu by goading or allowing or tacitly blessing Hezbollah attacking Israel, knowing that Netanyahu will have no choice but to respond. A member of his own cabinet said today Lebanon will burn, all of Lebanon will burn. So there's a lot of intense domestic pressure on Netanyahu to respond forcefully when those drones and missiles start coming from Hezbollah and Lebanon. General, President Trump posted today about Iran that they, quote, they get no money, not 10 cents. Is that true? Isn't Iran free to sell its oil on the open market right now, sanction-free, blockade lifted?
That's exactly right, Elizabeth. If we look at where we are today versus where we were February 27th, okay, now, in theory, the Gulf is open, or the Straits are open, and now we will proceed to negotiate with Iran as we were supposed to do in February. One of the big changes is now, unlike February, Iran is free to sell oil on the market. And that is money that whenever they've had cash, they have always prioritized rebuilding their military and funding proxies, the chief one of which being Hezbollah. And I'd also like to add, Elizabeth, when we looked at some of the challenges that the MOU might face before it was published, and identified the Israel-Hezbollah friction as a chief spoiler. That is now written into the DNA of the MOU. In the very first paragraph, we've taken the chief thing that could derail this and made it part of our agreement with Iran. I think that's really unfortunate.
Yeah, I think Lebanon is mentioned 3 times in that first paragraph, which is extraordinary. All right. Aaron David Miller, Mick Mulvaney, Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, thank you all 3 so much. Let's hope for a peaceful weekend.